Hi, this is Hannu TheHande Mäkinen, and welcome to Video Game Stories. This is a fun little series where I'll be bringing you fascinating stories about video games. And this is something that I wanted to do when I was doing my History of Video Games series, but now I have the time to tell these stories for you. And today's story relates to one of the single most important video games in history, Tetris. The story of Tetris is a story of license misappropriation, Nintendo handheld systems, and Alexey Pajitnov. Pajitnov created Tetris in the early 1980s when he was working as a researcher at a computer center in Moscow. And originally he created Tetris just as a way of killing time, but a couple of his friends realized that Tetris had a lot of entertainment potential, which is why in 1984 they imported it over to the IBM PCs. And it was that point that the Tetris was started to receive massive recognition all across the Soviet bloc. People started to make their own versions of Tetris in different computer centers, mostly as a sort of programming exercise. Then 2 years later, Tetris broke out of the Soviet bloc when representatives from a small British video game company, Andromeda, were visiting Budapest in Hungary, and saw a version of Tetris that had been made by a couple of local programmers. And they saw that it was a very addicting game and saw a lot of market potential with it. They tried to arrange a meeting with Pajitnov in order to discuss getting the license to release Tetris, but unfortunately they couldn't get a hold of him. So Andromeda did something a bit iffy and decided to license it from those Hungarian programmers that had made the version of Tetris they saw. Something that they really shouldn't have been able to do because, you know, those programmers didn't have any rights to Tetris. But Andromeda nevertheless left Budapest with the belief that they were now the sole license holders for this game called Tetris. After they came back to the UK, they quickly licensed the game to the Sinclair Computer Company, whose own in-house developers made the very first commercially released version of Tetris outside of the Soviet bloc. And Sinclair saw that this was a very popular game. In a very short amount of time, they licensed it to a number of other companies, most important among them Amiga, Sega, who made their own arcade version of Tetris, and Atari. So by 1988, Pajitnov was starting to think that, you know what, maybe I should copyright this game because, you know, people might want to copy it and make money off of it or something. So Pajitnov went to the Soviet government, and they were only too happy to help monitor the copyright of Tetris. And so in 1988, an official company was formed by the Soviet government called Elorg that was supposed to protect the market rights of Tetris, something that they were doing a very poor job of. Because apparently these Hungarian programmers, even though they licensed a game they had no right to, they did at least have the decency to inform Elorg of this, and so they were impatiently waiting for money to come from Andromeda. But in 1988, an important development happened, which is when a Japanese company called Nintendo decided that, you know what, Tetris is a pretty hot thing these days, we really want this game for ourselves. So Nintendo representatives went to Elorg and got Pajitnov to approve a version of Tetris for the NES. And not only that, they wanted exclusive handheld rights to versions of Tetris, because the following year they were bringing out this interesting device called the Game Boy. But once Nintendo did release their version of Tetris, they were in for a shocking surprise. Mainly that there was already a version of Tetris on the NES out in the US, made by Tengen. Now if you remember back to History of Video Games Part 4, Tengen and Nintendo had this very strained history with one another, with Tengen releasing these unlicensed black cartridge video games without paying licensing fees to Nintendo, something which they were not cool with at all. And before this, Nintendo's attitude towards Tengen was kind of dismissive. When they found out that they had released an unlicensed game, they would tell them to take it off the store shelves. However, Tetris was very different in two key ways. Number one was the fact that Nintendo had a lot of writing on Tetris, especially in the sense of the Game Boy. And secondly, and more importantly of all, is that Tengen actually sued Nintendo because they thought they had all the rights to release Tetris. Something I forgot to mention when I made Part 4 of the History of Video Games is that Tengen was actually a separate wing of Atari's game development wing. And this is how they acquired the license to produce Tetris. And the litigation process that followed did disturb a lot of shit in the gaming industry. For instance, Sega did not release a Mega Drive port of their arcade version of Tetris because they were a bit unsure whether or not they actually had the license. And this whole court scenario dragged on until 1993, when finally the courts decided in Nintendo's favor, because after all, they were the only company who had actually gone to Elor, the official company responsible for handling the copyright of Tetris. And that same court ruling found that Sinclair, Andromeda, and every single company that had acquired their license of Tetris through them did not have any rights to it whatsoever. Now, the court ruling was really awesome for Nintendo. The Game Boy version of Tetris would go on to become the best-selling version of the game, and for the next 3 years, Nintendo basically just had exclusive rights to Tetris. But the person who really lost out in all of this was actually the man who created the game in the first place, Alexey Pajitnov. Because even though Elorg was the company responsible for looking after the copyright of Tetris, they never paid a single ruble to Pajitnov for creating this awesome game. It took until 1996, when Pajitnov founded the Tetris company, which now guards the copyright to Tetris, that he started making profit off of it. One would say 10 years too late. So I hope you found that interesting. Next time I'm going to bring you a story related to Sega's lovable mascot, the Blue Hedgehog. I'm Hannu, TheHande Mäkinen. See you on the next one.